Okay, Caden, this is for you. I'm in my backyard a little bit, so I thought you could see. Maybe the cat or dog will show up at this one. The Landry News, Chapter 7. Fans brace for a grudge match. What is the mood of the classroom in the beginning of Chapter 7? The next question, Kara said she likes editorials because it's where you get to see the heart of the newspaper. What does Kara mean by this statement? By the way, Harley could come at any moment, so get ready. As the bell rang, someone else was sweating. The tall man is rumpled in a sports coat. There's Sydney. The tall man is rumpled in a sports coat, hunched in the lower part of the chair. Holding his newspaper a little higher than usual, he is starting the battle and getting ready, pretending to pay attention. He is looking at the batting averages, but he is seeing nothing but the image of a little girl in a brown plaid skirt, scared out of her wits, biting her lower lip. This was the same image he had thought about in his head all weekend, and now that little girl was in his classroom. Mr. Larson reached for his thermos for the 10th time that day and remembered for the 10th time he had forgotten his coffee on Friday and there was nothing in it. The kids came in and immediately began pulling the jumbles of desks into row. A room somehow felt safer with desks all lined up. Everyone sat down. There was no goofing off, no loud talking like there had been at the start of class on Friday. Everybody was waiting to see what would happen. Kara Landry sat as close as she could to the door by the back of the room. She wasn't really ready to see what was going to happen. She stared at her library book, the same page she read over and over again. When the bell rang, she jumped at the sound and quickly started to move. Joey DeLuca had been watching her and he smiled and gave her a thumbs up. Kara tried to smile back, but she shivered instead and focused her eyes by her open book, her note to Mr. Larson tucked in the front of that book. She gripped the cover lightly and moved toward him. Mr. Larson cleared his throat, noisily folding his paper, and stood up, holding the rumpled sheets of paper. Right away, he wished he hadn't stood up. He felt so tall, towering over those children in front of the classroom. Some of them looked at him just like they normally did, and some looked at them with clear eyes and white knuckles. Mr. Larson noticed she was reading the incident at Hawk Hill, and his mind tried to recall the plot of that story. Clearing his throat again, he said, "How many of you look at the Sunday paper this weekend?" Timidly, almost all of them raised their hands. This must be a little bit of an older book, because how many of you look at the Sunday paper? Without taking her eyes off her book, Kara raised her hand. She also read the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times. And if she could, she would read the New York Times too. How many of you looked at the Chicago Tribune? About half of them put their hands down. Fine. Hands down. Now, how many of you read anything other than the comics? Everybody put their hands down, except Joey and Kara. Kara looked from her book and looked around. Mr. Larson wasn't looking at her, but she could tell he had just looked away from her. And in that instant, Kara knew where these questions were heading. How many of you read more than the comics or the sports section of the Tribune? Joey's hand went down. Now only Kara's hand was up, and her face was pale. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, but she kept her hands up. "You can put your hand down, Kara," Mr. Larson said, "but tell me, can you remember any particular story in the Tribune?" To the rest of the class, it seemed like it was an accident that Mr. Larson was talking to only Kara now. Kara looked right at Mr. Larson, and looking at him made her feel better. He wasn't mad at her, but he wasn't angry, but he might have been a little frustrated. Lowering her hand, Kara said, "I remember all the stories I read in the Tribune. The lead story was about the Middle East crisis. The second story was about a murder in Chicago. And the third story was about the oldest horse on the police force." Mr. Larson says, "You remember all the stories?" Did you read the whole first section of the paper? Kara nodded. How about the arts and living section? Another nod. How about finance? How about travel? And Kara nodded her head. So what you're saying is that you basically read the entire Chicago Tribune on Sunday. The kids in class were following this exchange like a tennis match, back and forth, back and forth. All eyes were on Kara. How about the editorials? When his eyes locked with hers, he said it again. How about the editorials? The whole class stopped breathing, but Kara didn't miss a beat. Editorials? I always read the editorials. It's the best part of the paper. I like them very much. As Kara said, the sports section is also something. He almost went, phew, but he stopped. And why do you like the editorials so much? Kara was all set to say, because the editorials can speak right up and tell the world if something is wrong or lazy or stupid or crooked, but she bit those words. And in a heartbeat, she stopped and she thought. Because, Mr. Larson, it adds a little mercy to a conversation of something you want to say. Mr. Larson prompted her again. You like the editorials. Why? Kara took another few seconds, choosing her words with great care. And because, she said, it's where the newspaper has things that are hard to say but need to be said. Where the newspaper apologizes if it makes a mistake. It's where you get to see the heart of the newspaper. Mr. Larson smiled. The heart of the newspaper. I didn't know newspapers had hearts. Kara couldn't help but smile to herself. Only good newspapers have hearts, she said. Mr. Larson said. That's all? Just Mr. Larson took 3 steps back, bending over a little. He patted the stack of newspapers. He said, these newspapers aren't good for much. So how about if each of you take 1 or 2, clip them out, read them, and pass them around, and compare them, and see what kind of heart the Sun-Times has, or the Tribune, or write down what you think, and maybe you can share this in a couple days. And with that, Mr. Larson sat down, opened his newspaper, eyed the sports page, reached for his thermos, poured some cold coffee from Friday, and didn't plan on drinking it, but poured it anyway. And forms of lines showed up behind the newspaper. The tension in the class was gone, and the familiar hum of noise, increasing rapidly, came. Kara immediately stood up, dragged the desk into the corner, pulled the map tripod behind her, sat down in her makeshift office, and her heart began racing. And she smiled. Mr. Larson wasn't mad at her, and she had gotten to apologize to him, sort of. She also smiled because the whole class had an assignment, their first real assignment since school had started. But it was more than that. Kara smiled because she had gotten an idea for the next edition of the Landry News. Let me see if I can get Harley up here to say hello, and then I'll sign off. Harley, come here. Come here. Let's see if she comes. Okay, here comes Sydney, dragging Harley. I hope you guys can see. There goes Sydney tripping. Come here, girl. Can you see her, guys?
I can see her.
I hope you can see her. Okay, talk to you soon.